Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Jazakallah for everyone joining. We're going to make a start now. So, quick introductions. My name is Fatin Yasser. Inshallah, I'll be hosting today's seminar, I suppose, a lecture, whatever you want to call it. It's a talk, really, a short talk hosted by AMRA, the Ahmadiyya Muslim Research Association. And the purpose of these monthly talks is to basically make scientific topics, research topics accessible to the general public, as well as other researchers who may be interested. We've had a plethora of other presenters present their specific fields. And today we are joined by Umar Nasser Sahib, who is going to give us a talk on psychiatry. Umar Sahib, I'll hand it over to you. And inshallah, the process will be that we'll stick with the talk, with the presentation, and then towards the end, we will open it to the audience for any questions. Oh, my bad. We should start with Tilawat, of course. Can I request Aliana and Raja Sahib for Tilawat?
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم سبح اسم ربك الأعلى الذي خلق فسوى والذي قدر فهدى والذي أخرج المرعى فجعله غثاء أحوى سنقرئك فلا تنسى إلا ما شاء الله إنه يعلم الجهر وما يخفى ونيسرك لليسرى فذكر إن نفعت الذكرى. Translation: I seek refuge with Allah from Satan the accursed, in the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful. Glorify the name of thy Lord, the Most High, who creates and perfects, and who designs and guides, and who brings forth the pasturage, then turns it black, rotten rubbish. We shall teach thee the Quran, and thou shalt forget it not, except as Allah wills. Surely He knows what is open and what is hidden, and we shall facilitate for thee every facility. So go on reminding. Surely reminding is profitable. Jazakallah.
Jazakallah. Umar Sahib, over to you now. You're muted.
Okay, hi. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for coming. Peace be upon you all. So can you hear me, and let me know if I share the screen, just that you can see me, rather see the screen. Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
And is that sort of
slideshow? Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you all for coming. My name's Umar. I'm a psychiatrist in Surrey now, and I'm going to be presenting some work I did actually in academic philosophy during a master's in philosophy and mental health at UCLan. So it was a part-time master's I did there, and my thanks to Professor Ayoub and Thornton for their support through the whole course, actually. Now, let's just kind of remember the background of psychiatry. And a lot of the beginning will be kind of stating the obvious, but hopefully with a reason. Psychiatry treats the mentally unwell. So the idea here is that in the same way that people can have physical sickness, they can also have, they can also be mentally unwell. There can be physical disorders and there can be mental disorders, which it may seem like it's a relatively uncontroversial idea if you frame it like that, because who doesn't want their broken bones mended? Who doesn't want their infections cured? But the nature of mental disorder is quite different in many respects, because you are essentially saying that a particular mental state of a particular person is disordered, i.e. the way that they see the world and the way that they feel is something is going wrong with something which is much closer to the core of them. If you break a bone, then it doesn't affect your self-identity as the same if someone says you are psychotic and that person that you've been talking to is not real. There's something about the mind which is just much closer to your core than the body. And there's also other differences in the treatment between mental illness and physical illness. So this is Bethlehem. This is the famous mental hospital in London. It's currently in South London. It's also always been in South London. And this is where the word Bedlam comes from. So, i.e., this is a place where mentally unwell people are treated. And this is a place, this is the Caledon Centre in Coventry. This is where I spent much of my training. So this is a more modern mental hospital. And the nature of treating people with mental disorders is that very often you will, or fairly often, you will detain them in a mental hospital like this and treat them sometimes forcibly. So sometimes they won't want to take medications and you will force them via IM, intramuscular injections. And it will be done on the basis of the idea that I, as a doctor and as a team, we think that you're unwell mentally. There is something going wrong in your mind. And even though you think you're fine, or even though you don't think this is a problem in the same way that we do, we believe that where you need to be is here and you're here, and we're going to get you there basically no matter what. Okay. Now, obviously, there are things involved like risks. There have to be sufficient risks to detain. We need to be, relatively sure that we can treat whatever is going on. But you don't have this kind of issue generally in physical health illness. You don't have this with broken bones. I mean, it's not an issue in the sense that everyone usually wants to get their physical health treated, especially the more acute things. But with acute mental health things, often the more acute it is, the less they want to be, the less they will see themselves as unwell, because they may be really psychotic and therefore have what we call poor insight. So there is a difference. But ultimately, you may think, well, it is a noble tradition and a noble discipline, and I certainly think so. But there are some inherent problems which are clinical problems, but they're actually deeper philosophical problems, which is why I kind of went down the more academic philosophy route to try and tease out some of these issues latent in psychiatry and in mental illness. And while it may seem on a superficial blush that it's actually, it can't be that hard. If someone's depressed or if someone's unwell, they'll want treatment. But actually, it can be quite difficult, because how do you tell the depressed from the sad? How do you distinguish between someone being mentally unwell and someone just having a normal reaction to, different life circumstances? It's not that easy. And usually what we tend to do is we tend to look at the context. So if you have just won £1 million in the lottery and you are extremely happy and you're going out there spending a lot of money, then that may actually be a pretty normal reaction. But if you're just a regular Joe Schmo like you and I, and you're like that, and you're doing all these slightly bizarre things, then you might think, oh, this person's manic, right? And if someone has passed away, then you might be quite aggrieved, and you might be, kind of low in your mood for a few weeks or months. And that might be quite normal, because someone you've loved has left you. But if you're like that and there's no obvious trigger, or it's prolonged for much longer than you would think, then you may say, okay, this person's depressed. So it's dependent on the context. So that is one aspect of how you can tell the difference. But it's significant because psychiatric treatment, unlike physical health, well, somewhat like physical health, but often the willingness is not there as readily in mental health, has side effects. So there's the stigma of having a mental health diagnosis. There's the fact that you have forced treatment and detention, and you give them medication that literally alters their mind. Okay, but there are some central questions. So this is the first one. This one. So the first one, the almost central question is that first one. How do we distinguish between mental disorders and normal variation? So that's what I've explained, in that you often look at the context, and there's a whole literature there of how to do so. And there's lots of controversy there. You know, some people will say, oh, you can only be agreed for 2 weeks. Some people will say 4 weeks. Some people will say, you know, whatever it is. But actually, that's not the key question. The central question to me is, how do we justify the idea of a mental disorder? Because how do we actually say that any one of these states is disordered? What does that really mean, to say that actually there is a mental state that you can have which we will label as something is going wrong here? Because if you're saying something is going wrong, then it indicates that you have a sense that there is something that should be right, that there is a way the mind should be. And that should be is the question. What do you mean by should be? How can we justify the idea that that a human mind should be in a particular way? Now, there have been, you know, these are two popular theorists that have tackled this, and they converge on similar ideas. So one of them is Christopher Borse, another Jerome Wakefield. They're both American. One's in Chicago, one's elsewhere, New York, I think. So Borse's biostatistical theory is the following. He says that health is a descriptively definable property, which is usually valuable, one which enabled the bearer to be free of disease insofar as its mode of functioning conforms to the natural design of that kind of organism. So he's basically saying that if you're healthy, if you're fine, if your mind is working right in the psychiatric context, then you are conforming, your mind is conforming to its natural design, i.e., there is a natural way that an organism is supposed to be. And he says that disease, in this case psychiatric disease, is a deviation from the normal functioning design of the organism. Perfect working order is a matter not of the worth of the product, but of conformity to a fixed design. So again, there's this idea that you are designed, and that you have a natural design, and that is the right way that you are. And if you deviate from that, then it becomes, then you say something's going wrong. Okay. And what's important to note here is that this is capable of including, for instance, those issues of grief, or if you just won the lottery, because those are the designed natural reactions to your particular circumstances, right? So that's, nothing's going wrong if you feel really happy if you won the lottery. Nothing's going wrong if you feel sad because you've lost a loved one, because that is the way that you've been designed. That is the way things are supposed to be. But there's this question of design, because, like, does that mean it's a creationist? Does that mean that, you know, we have been created by God? And obviously, being an academic philosopher, he cannot possibly accept that. So he says it is no part of biological theory to assume that what is natural is desirable, still less the product of divine artifice. Artifice meaning manufacture, creation. So he says, you know, there's a lot of different ways that you can think about natural functions, because this idea of natural function is, i.e., the way things are supposed to be. Whatever the correct analysis of function statements is, in the end, biological theory is deeply committed to attributing functions to processes in plants and animals, i.e., you have a function, for instance, to feel happy when something good happens to you. You have a function to feel sad, to indicate that you've lost something which was important to you. So these are natural capacities or functions, and these can dysfunction. So the idea of function and dysfunction is key to this kind of analysis. And he says we shall assume both that there are natural mental functions, and also that recognized types of psychopathology are unnatural interferences with these functions. So for him, a mental disorder is kind of quite literally the opposite of the mental order. There's a way things are supposed to be, and if it goes wrong, then you say that they're unwell. So you have mental functions of thinking and feeling, of perceiving, but when they dysfunction, when things are working well, you perceive the tree outside of me. If they're dysfunctioning, I see a small man sitting on my windowsill because something is going wrong. I have a perceptive faculty, a function, which is dysfunctioning. Now, Wakefield is another theorist. These guys are kind of engaged in a 60-year battle. And he says what a mental disorder is a harmful dysfunction. So he says it's not just a dysfunction, because you can have pretty minor dysfunctions, but no one really cares. And what makes it a disorder is there has to be a social element of people saying that this thing is bad, is negative. So there's a social attribution. But there is, even in his analysis, still this idea of a dysfunction. And he says the condition, i.e. a psychiatric condition, must be caused by a dysfunction, that is, by a failure of some physiological or psychological mechanism to perform a natural function that it was biologically designed to perform. Thus, biological function and biological dysfunction, construed as a failure of biological design, are factual concepts in the sense that they are scientifically descriptive and not evaluative, which basically means that we are saying that it is an objective fact of nature. Like this is the real hard stuff, that you are meant to work in a certain way, i.e. you have been biologically designed, and that you can dysfunction. And that in order to call something a mental disorder, there has to be some kind of dysfunction at the heart of it. But that's a little bit weird, because if you're constantly talking about biological design, actual design, then how do you square that with Darwinism? How do you square that with our modern idea of evolution, which is not the only variation of evolution you can have, but there's this modern idea, by modern I mean in the lens of history, last 150 years, that humans have not been designed by God. They have not been designed with actual intention. They have been produced by natural selection and natural variation. And that is fundamentally a non-mentalistic picture, i.e. there's no minds involved. God or angels, they're not involved in designing the human evolution or animal evolution. Everything has happened essentially by accident, but via certain mechanisms of variation and selection. The variation is sort of random chance in mutations, is the modern version of the theory, and then those are selected according to the environmental circumstance. But that environmental circumstance is not, produced by a mind either. So at the heart of it, things are unguided. There is no actual design involved at all. The whole point of Darwin's analysis was to say that there is no design. Even from when he was a young man in Edinburgh, he was part of a sort of free thinkers, materialist society. And if you trace the evolution of his idea through his notebooks, it's very clear that his whole intention was to get God out of science and God out of biology, because they all already felt like they could get God out of other parts of science, but they wanted to get away from creationism and the kind of the classically Christian idea that nature was kind of directly produced with God in the loop. So his whole motivation, and this isn't that controversial, I don't think, is that he wanted to get design out of nature. So there's a tension here. How can you both say that the entire edifice of mental disorders, and in fact physical disorders as well, the entire edifice of disease is based on the idea that there is a biological design to organisms, but on the other hand saying nothing is actually designed and it's all just the way the wind blows through the course of evolution? Okay, so we can think about mental functions. Or let's transition now to the next part of this, which is, if we want to actually break this down a little bit more, then we need to understand not just what is a mental function, but on a philosophical level, what is a function? Because as I've said, dysfunction and function is at the heart of this. So mental disorder equals mental dysfunction, and we can only understand what a dysfunction is if we understand what a function is. And if we have a think about functions, then we may be able to tease out, can you have Darwinian evolution and also have the idea of functions? So what we're going to do is we're going to use a method in philosophy called conceptual analysis, which sounds very fancy, but it's, as one philosopher said, it is an attempt to describe what people think they are referring to. They're trying to describe the criteria of application that the members of the linguistic community generally have, implicitly or explicitly, in mind when they use the term. So, and let me just reiterate, the reason why we're doing this is because we want to understand how you can have a function in nature. Because if we can figure out what a function is, we may be able to figure out whether you can have a function without design being behind it, without a mind being behind it. And if you can have a function without a mind being behind it, then you can have dysfunctions, and then there's no problem, right? You can have Darwinian evolution in the background while also believing in psychiatric illness. So we're going to do this conceptual analysis. But to do so, we need to kind of think about, well, what is the function of anything? And the answer to that is just look around you. So whatever you have on your desk, you can look at it and you can say, pick up an item or have a look at an item and say, okay, what is that thing? What is the function of it? So I'll show you my desk. This is oh wait, no, that's AI. This is my desk. So you can see I've got various things. I've got a mouse, and the function of that you can say is in order to control the cursor on the computer. I've got a keyboard with a few keys missing, and the function of that is to transcribe my words in my mind into the software of the computer. I've got a monitor, and you can say the function of that is to produce the image. I've got a microphone. The function of that is to transcribe my audio information into a way that you can hear, etc., etc. So we can say that things have all these functions. This is very, very basic. This isn't, but most philosophy is actually quite basic. It just sounds fancy. But once you get past the terms, it's like basically writing down common sense. So let's take a common example of a knife, and we can do a conceptual analysis of a knife and try and figure out what is the function of the knife. It's not that hard. The function of the knife is to cut. I think most people would agree with that. Most people in the literature over many decades have agreed with this idea. But functions are a little bit weird. They're a little bit weird because you can have functions which are, it's actually, if you analyze it in the way that we do, they have some odd qualities. So firstly, let's talk about the basic idea of the function. The function of the knife is to cut. Now, that's essentially the same statement as saying the purpose of the knife is to cut, or the point of the knife is to cut. So what we're doing here is we're understanding that the function of something is the purpose of it, the point of it. And that immediately gets us back to the idea that it's the purpose or it's the goal of the person who made it. Like, you say the function of something is this when you're talking about what did the person who made it intend for it, okay? So the function of this glass was intended to be to drink water. That seems to be the basic idea. But functions are related to goals. The goals of the designer and manufacturer. So let's say it's related to purpose. But what's strange is that's not all a knife can do. A knife can be a paperweight or a doorstop. You can use that as a paperweight. You can use it to stop doors if you really are not fond of your feet. So, but that you wouldn't say that's its function. You would say, okay, the knife is functioning as a paperweight, or the knife is functioning as a doorstep. But what you mean by that is this wasn't its real purpose, but it can be used for this other thing. So it's not like just an effect, because the knife can have the effect of stopping the door. A function seems to be different from a mere effect. And there's other things. So for instance, a knife can have the effect of nicking my thumb. It can scratch the chopping board, but you wouldn't say this is the function of the knife. Like, the reason this knife was made was to cut people's thumbs. So that's a side effect, but it also has intermediate effects. So when you're cutting, for instance, you're extending your triceps. Is that right? Yeah, you're extending your triceps when you're cutting. When you're cutting, you're also producing sounds, but you wouldn't say that that's the purpose or the function of the knife. It's not to extend triceps or to produce sounds. So function is not just an effect. That's quite important. But sometimes an object can have a function even if it can't fulfill it. So you can have functions that are made with, you can have knives that are made that are blunt. So it can't actually cut. But if you ask the manufacturer, what is the function of this knife, or even look at it, you say, well, the function of this knife is to cut, but it just can't do it. Or maybe you can't hold it. It's got a defect in its grip. Maybe it's sharp or whatever. So you can't actually cut anything with the knife. So functions can exist even when they can't be physically realized, because the function of that object, that knife, is still to cut, but actually it could never do it because there's something wrong with it. There's a malfunction, but functions still exist even when there's a malfunction, even when there's a problem with it. And to get even more esoteric, functions can be impossible to realize. So a classic example is a perpetual motion machine. So you can have an inventor. It's not done as much these days, but 1,000 years ago, this was a thing. People would try and make perpetual motion machines where they'll try and have free energy forever. And if you ask them what this contraption's function is, it's to produce perpetual motion. Now, we know that that is a physical impossibility, but you can't really attribute any other function to that contraption, because that was the purpose that that person made it made in mind. Now, with respect to a knife, you could say, let's say you're mentally unwell. You say, okay, this knife will protect me from ghosts, or this knife gives me the ability to fly. And this person has made this knife, let's say. Well, then that, if they've actually made that knife, and that was the purpose, that was the intention that they had in mind, that is the purpose of that knife, even if you know it's never going to do that. Okay, so functions can exist even if they're impossible, and even if they're never realized. You know, many knives probably every year are thrown away before they're ever used, or they're lost in delivery, or they're, you know, whatever, they end up in landfill before they ever get anywhere. But if you ask what was the function of that knife, it was to cut. Okay, so I know all that sounds like incredibly obvious, but there's a reason we're going through this. And the question which comes from this is, how can a function exist if it's not just an effect? It exists in malfunction. It's never realized. It's impossible to realize. It tells us that the idea of a function is not actually dependent on the material composition of the object. It's not a material thing, because it can be there even if the knife never could cut. It could be there even if the knife never did cut. And the knife has all these other physical effects. It extends your triceps, it makes sounds, but those aren't part of its function. So the function is not material. The function is the purpose, and the function is the purpose of the person who made it. So a function is an intended effect. Okay, and this is very important. A function is an intended effect, and the intention belongs to the mind that was involved in the creation of that artifact. Now you might think, all right, job done. Now we understand what functions are. That's it. So now we can apply this across the board. But I think that would be a bit hasty, because there is this division in nature you have, or in the world. You have artifact functions and you have natural functions. So most of the things I've been talking about are artifacts in the way that they've been made, right? They've been made by humans. But nature is full of, you know, things which we attribute functions to. And when we're talking about psychiatry, when we're talking about illness, we're saying that there are mental functions that people have, of emotion, of perception, etc. So on this analysis, it seems to be saying that natural functions are also intended effects, that the idea of a natural function is secondary to the idea that there has been a mind involved in the production of that capacity. So let's just check this, though, because, you know, you may say, well, artifact functions and natural functions, maybe they are two very different things. Maybe you can't just apply what you assumed for an artifact function to a natural function. And again, I'll remind you, this is actually asking what is the concept of a function, because mental illness is justified by the concept of dysfunction. So we have to ask, what is the concept of function? What does that really mean? And what does it entail? So does the heart have a purpose like the knife? Well, you'd usually say yes. The purpose of the heart is to pump blood. Okay. But it also makes thumping sounds. And you'd probably say that's not the purpose of the heart. Oh, that's the wrong analogy. But people used to say, oh, the purpose of the nose is to hold up eyeglasses. Hearts can also malfunction. So if you have pump failure, then their ability to pump may be bad or almost vanished. But you'd still say the purpose of that person's heart is to function blood, is to pump blood. So the heart can have a function even in malfunction. Other organisms, so for instance, if the heart never functions, then, you know, it's not viable with life. But for instance, you know, women, for instance, are born with eggs, which the purpose of them ultimately is to aid in reproduction. But if, you know, a child passes away before reproductive age, those eggs are never used. So the purpose of that, but do those eggs still have a purpose? You'd say yes. The purpose of those eggs, or the function of those eggs, is to assist in reproduction. So natural structures can have functions, even in malfunction, even if they're never used. So actually, natural functions, the way that we talk about natural functions is basically identical to the way that we talk about artifacts. Okay, so this indicates that actually we shouldn't have a separate way of thinking about natural functions as we do for artifact functions. Our whole concept of a function is an intended effect, is the idea that this thing was intended, okay? And that's something we inherit from artifact functions. But actually, that's the essence of how we talk about natural things. It's like, this is why it's there. This is the heart's purpose. But how can the heart be said to really have a purpose if it wasn't intended by anything? Now, I have made a symmetry between artifact functions and natural functions. And this is, this has been a big problem. But because basically people admit this, all the academic philosophers admit that they seem to be pretty much identical. It seems clear that conscious and natural functions are functions in the same sense, despite their obvious differences. This is from Larry Wright. He's a big philosopher we're going to talk about a bit more in a minute. Functional ascriptions of either sort have a profoundly similar ring. Compare the function of that cover is to keep the distributor dry, with the function of the epiglottis is to keep food out of the windpipe. Basically, it's the same thing. It is even more difficult to detect a difference in what is being requested. What is the function of the human windpipe versus what is the function of a car's exhaust pipe? So the way we talk about artifact functions and natural functions is identical, which indicates that our internal concept of a function is the same. It's that functions are intended effects. So natural functions therefore only make sense if they're intended effects. And this has been a big problem in philosophy, because how can you square this with Darwinism? How can you square this with the idea that there is no intention in nature, that things happen without mind? Because if then you accept evolution, which, Darwinian evolution, mindless evolution, which is perfectly viable, you can do that. You can accept that we have come here through evolution, through Darwinian evolution without any kind of mind. But you can't then say that natural structures have functions. You can't then say that in reality, not just as a manner of speaking, but as in reality, the function of the heart is to pump blood. Because to say that the function of the heart is to pump blood is to say that the purpose of the heart is to pump blood. And to say that the purpose of the heart is to pump blood is to attribute mind to nature, and you can't do that. Now, if you think about then when we apply this to psychiatry, this is a problem. Because if I say to my psychotic patient who is hearing all kinds of voices, and I say, well, I think you're mentally unwell because your mind is playing a trick on you. Hearing is supposed to be linked. Your ability to hear is linked to your ability to hear actual things going on around you. But you are hearing things which are not things that are going on around you. You are hearing things and sounds that your mind is producing. And he could turn around to me and say, well, how do you know that? How can you say that the function of my hearing is to hear things around me? What does that mean? What if actually the function of my ear is to hear things inside my own head as well? And what if everyone with every different mental state can just say, well, this is the function. This is the function for me. I.e., you can actually say that everything is equally viable because nature makes no preference, because nature has no purpose. If every mental state out there is equally viable, is a normal variant, is just a variant, and you can't say that one is right and one is wrong, then the whole idea of mental disorder crumbles, because the schizophrenic can just say, I'm just a normal variant human, mate. You can't lock me up. You can't treat me, because there's no particular thing that my mind is supposed to do. You just happen to be in the majority, but that doesn't mean that you're right. That doesn't mean that there is such a thing that you're supposed to do. Your mental capacities don't really have a purpose. So philosophically, the whole idea of treating mental disorder doesn't work. And so we come back to this problem of Darwinism, because Darwinism does tell us that there is no mind in nature, that nature is mindless, and the way we've been produced is mindless. So we have to then figure out a way around this, is what the philosopher said. We have to avoid actual design, right? Naturalists needed a way of having natural functions without appealing to the actual design in the production of living organisms. And so what this guy Larry Wright did, and he's the main one who everyone else has followed, is he said, I can explain this without intention. I can explain how you can have function without intention by saying that you can have function with selection. And so this gets a bit obscure, so I'll do my best to explain it, but it's pretty hard because I don't think it makes good sense. He says that the function of a thing is the thing that explains why that thing is there. Okay? So the function of X is that particular consequence of its being where it is, which explains why it's there. So he would, for instance, say that the function of the knife is to cut That's why it's there. But how, the natural question is, isn't that reverse causality? The function of the knife is to cut, and then the cutting explains the knife. So something, in the future explains the past. If you're asking, how did the knife get its function? And you're like, because the knife can cut. It's like, how does that make sense? It can only make sense if you say that the human has selected that quality in their mind on the basis of the selection criteria of, I want something that can cut. And then they have produced that knife. So he will say that the function of the glass is to hold water. And the reason why that is its function is because that function explains how it got there. That function explains how the glass got there. And how did the glass get there? Because a human selected that function in their mind. So what he says is that selection is the important thing, but nature can select too. So he gives this analogy. I've adapted it because he used old airlines. I'm using modern airlines. He says, okay, look, let's say you're choosing between different airlines, okay? And person one is saying, okay, I want a cheap flight. Okay, so their selection criteria is money. They want to save money, so they'll go for EasyJet. But person two says, I want a flight with good legroom. Okay, so they have that in mind as their selection criteria, and they choose British Airways, for instance. Okay, so he's saying that is the same way that we produce functions in the world, that we have a selection criteria, and that produces the functions that we see around us. So it's really a selected consequence etiology. Etiology means how something got there, its background. And he's saying that the consequence explains the background because it was selected. Now, there's a bit of an issue with that, which probably is fairly obvious, which is that when you're thinking, like the analogy he actually gives to explain this requires a human who is selecting. Now, selection requires consciousness, right? It's an intentional act. It's okay, I don't want the cheap prices, I want the legroom. That involves a mind making a decision, which is part of intention. And then another person may think, okay, I don't really care about the legroom. I want to save some money, so I'm going to go for EasyJet, let's say. Okay, that is a mind that is involved. So his very analogy requires a mind. But when you look at nature and you're looking at things like twigs and mountains and mud, how can you say that they have minds? And how can you say that they are the ones that are selecting? Okay, so that doesn't really work in my view at all, because selection requires a mind and intention. So intention is greater than selection. So I think this whole thing fails. And I think we're back to square one, which is that a function is an intended effect. A function is an intended effect. He tries to say that a function is just a selected effect. And yeah, humans can select, but nature can select as well. But nature can't select. Nature can only select as a metaphor, right? I mean, the act of selection is, I'm choosing this. It requires a mind. But then you might say, well, hold on. What about natural selection? Isn't that what Darwin said? Like the whole idea of evolution by natural selection is that there is selection in nature. But what I'm going to finally come to, this is the last section, is that actually Darwin made the same mistake as well. And actually everyone has inherited this whole mistake from Darwin. And if you read The Origin of Species, it's extremely clear. It's in his first chapter, first 1 or 2 chapters, but especially in his first chapter, he lays out all its thinking, and I'm going to show you how there are obvious defects in his thinking. So the central mystery of The Origin of Species is how the innumerable species inhabiting this world have been modified so as to acquire that perfection of structure and co-adaptation, which most justly excites our admiration, which is a very fancy way of saying, how did everything get here? Like, this stuff looks amazing. How did all this stuff get here? And he says, this is his whole argument. And actually, he says in The Origin of Species, my book is one long argument, and this is the argument. And I'm going to present his argument. He says, it seemed to me probable that a careful study of domesticated animals and of cultivated plants would offer the best chance of making out this obscure problem. So basically he's saying, if I look at animals under domestication and plants that have been cultivated by people, I can figure out how the whole of nature came to be. I've invariably found that our knowledge, imperfect though it be, of variation under domestication afforded the best and safest clue. So he's saying, I can figure out how nature came to be by looking at how humans cultivate nature. Okay. So he says, for instance, one of the most remarkable features in our domesticated races is that we see in them adaptation, not to the animals or plants' own good, but to man's use or fancy. So he's basically saying that, you know, what's amazing in domestication is that they get adapted, but not to their own good, but to the person's good. So you can think about this in dog breeding, for instance. For some reason, people really like really quite bizarre qualities in dogs. And all dogs are one species, but they've just been crossbred to have completely different qualities. So some of them will be like the Labradoodles, I think they're called, and some of them will be the pit bulls, right? And it's dependent on what that person wants to produce. So the domesticator or the dog breeder will be like, well, some people really like fluffy dogs. Some people really like the dogs that will, you know, kill a burglar, right? And I'm going to breed the animals in such a way that produces those qualities. And so he keeps referring to the goals, to the goal directedness of the breeders, of man's power of accumulative selection. Nature gives successive variations. Man adds them up in certain directions useful to him. So this is all intention. This is all intended effects. Okay. But then he starts talking about how this conscious or methodical selection can also be accompanied by unconscious selection. Hence, if man goes on selecting and thus augmenting any peculiarity, he will almost certainly unconsciously modify other parts of the structure, owing to the mysterious laws of the correlation of growth. So he says, well, if you're selecting for fluffiness, then you may also, without realizing, be selecting it for pointy ears. But you didn't have pointy ears in mind, but you'll end up with pointy ears if actually what you were going for was fluffiness, because the fluffiness and the pointed ears genes are next to each other. He didn't know about the genes, but that's what it'll be something like that. So he says you can have conscious or methodical selection, but you can also have unconscious selection. So he's like, you're consciously selecting for the fluffiness, but you're unconsciously selecting for pointy ears. You don't realize it. Well, that's what he claims. And then he extends this to natural selection. So he says, as man can produce and certainly has produced a great result by his methodical and unconscious means of selection, what may not nature affect? Okay. So he says, in the same way that you can have conscious selection and you can sometimes select things unconsciously, you can extend that to nature and say that nature can have goals. He says, I have called this principle by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved by the term of natural selection, in order to mark its relation to man's power of selection. We have seen that man by selection can produce great results and can adapt organic being to his own uses through the accumulation of slight but useful variations given to him by the hand of nature. So he's saying that in the same way that man can select and add up certain qualities, nature can do the same thing. And so he extends the metaphor, he extends the idea of conscious selection into natural selection. Okay, and then finally, his final move is to declare what man does methodically and unconsciously can be done by nature unconsciously to a far greater degree. As man can certainly produce great results by adding up in any given direction mere individual effects, so could nature, but far more easily for having much more time. So it says man can do this, but nature can do this as well because nature has much more time. So this is actually his logic. His logic is you can consciously select things as a human, but you can also unconsciously select things. And if you can unconsciously select things, then nature can unconsciously select things. So he slips from one to the other to the other. But this is a pretty elementary mistake, because when you are consciously selecting something, You have an intention, you have a goal in mind, you have fluffiness in mind, and you're trying to hit it. The fact that you may also be selecting unconsciously for other qualities doesn't matter, because that unconscious selection is actually just a side effect of you consciously having a goal in mind and trying to hit that goal. That is the main show, is the fact that humans, when they breed animals, they have a goal in mind and they are doing things, they're intervening in nature in order to produce that goal. And he gives actually no logic in order to extend that to mindless nature, because the salient point of domestication, of human breeding, is intention and of having a mind and of having a goal. So how can you just apply that to nature when nature doesn't have a mind, doesn't have any goals? You can't. He just kind of has this verbal slippage, because you can consciously select. Well, you might accidentally select for certain qualities, and if you can kind of accidentally select for certain qualities, then nature can select. But when you're accidentally selecting, you're actually still, that is just a passenger on the train, but the train is conscious selection. So conscious selection needs a mind and intention. Nature doesn't have that. So he just slips from one to the other, and the last 150 years of philosophy has been defined by this, sadly, this quite bad argument. And this was noticed at the time. This was noticed that he anthropomorphized nature. He was only able to get away with this linguistically because he kept on talking about nature like it was a person. Natural selection can act only through and for the good of each being. Well, how does nature know the good of each being? What does that mean? And he does this all the time. And this was noticed at the time. So this was a review at the time, in the Quarterly Review. Here and in many other parts of his work, where the desire for brevity cannot be pleaded as an excuse, the author manifestly endows nature with the intelligent faculty of designing and planning. Again, the more one reads and reflects, the more puzzled he becomes as to the powers attributed by the author to natural selection. At one time, it is nature, and compared to man, that is to say man's mind, for it acts intelligently. So he is always attributing to nature the things that can only be attributed to a mind. And this is Alfred Russel Wallace. And he's a really interesting guy, because he is actually the co-founder of this theory of evolution. Originally, it was called the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution. And just towards the end, we're just going to say a few words about him, because he actually broke with Darwin. He ended up saying that I made a mistake. Evolution is real, but it can only be directed by God. And that was a huge break in the, I think, 1870s between Darwin and Wallace. Before that, they'd always been seen together. But now you've probably never heard of Wallace, because he's been written out of the history books, essentially, because he turned towards a theistic idea that, yes, evolution happened, but it was guided by a mind. And he said the main problem with Darwin's philosophy was this idea that nature has a mind and can act in a way that only a mind can. And Darwin admitted this. So we have their letters. Yeah, Darwin admitted this. This is a letter from Darwin. He said the term natural selection is in some respects a bad one, as it seems to imply conscious choice. But, but this will be disregarded after a little familiarity. The term is so far a good one, as it brings into connection the production of domestic races by man's power of selection and the natural preservation of varieties and species. For brevity's sake, I may sometimes speak of natural selection as an intelligent power, in the same way that you talk about the attraction of gravity moving the planets. But he basically said this is just linguistic. And he actually said in this letter, in my next book, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to make sure no one can actually be confused by this. And so this is hilarious, because this is in his next book. He was like, okay, I'm not going to use the natural selection metaphor as much, but I'm going to use the metaphor of architecture. So it says, if our architect succeeded in rearing a noble edifice using the rough wedge-shaped fragments for the arches, the longer stones for the lintels, and so forth, we would admire his skill. So it is with selection, whether applied by man or by nature. For though variability is indispensably necessary, etc., etc. So he basically says that, okay, maybe natural selection wasn't the best metaphor, but let's use the metaphor of architecture. It's like, this is the same issue. An architect is a person with a mind who has an intention to produce something and therefore works in a certain way to get to that goal. That's not a good metaphor for applying for nature if you're saying that nature doesn't have a mind. And so you can't have your cake and eat it too. And this is the problem with naturalistic philosophy, in particular in this area, is that they're always having to try to have their cake and eat it too. They're trying to say there are no minds in the background of nature. Darwinian evolution is completely correct and it's completely true, But also we're going to keep all these concepts which require design, actual intended design. But you can only have intended design if you admit that there has been some kind of designer in nature. Okay, so applied to our particular question of mental illness, let's remind ourselves the entire question that has motivated us, that has motivated this search, is how do I justify the idea of mental disorder? Because I need that justification to lock people away and give them injections. How can I justify this idea of mental disorder? Well, you justify it by saying that you have mental functions and you have mental dysfunctions. And mental dysfunctions means that something is going wrong, and therefore we should be allowed to treat you. But if there are no mental functions, let me say that again. The idea of a mental function depends on the idea of there being actual design. So if there is no actual design, then there are no mental functions. And if there are no mental functions, then there's no mental dysfunctions. If there's no mental dysfunctions, then there's no mental disorders, and you can't lock anyone up. Okay? So just to briefly say that once more, because I know this is the nature of academic philosophy. It hurts your head. I think this is an accurate image. But the idea of a mental disorder is that there is a mental dysfunction, which means that there must be a mental function. If there is a mental function, according to the best philosophical arguments, there must be actual design behind that mental function. If there's no design, then there's no mental function. If there's no mental function, there's no mental dysfunction. And therefore, you shouldn't be able to lock people up. But everyone uses all these concepts which are fundamentally theistic in order to justify atheistic concepts. So if you want to read a little bit more about Alfred Russel Wallace, which I think is the core tension here between him and Darwin, there's this wonderful book, Intelligent Evolution by Michael Flannery, which I recommend. And because I'm contractually obliged to plug my YouTube channel wherever I go, we did a interview with the guy, Michael Flannery, who wrote that on rational religion, part of the community's outreach department. And that goes through this whole difference of saying that evolution was designed and evolution was intended versus evolution happened through purely natural, mindless forces. So sorry, I ran over a little bit there, but that's the presentation. Thank you.
Dr. Umar, amazing presentation. Quite dense, as one would expect with any academic topic, let alone philosophy, but really enjoyable. So Jazakallah for that.